And let me start us out with a couple of big themes that are going to be themes for our discussions all week. And there are three of them in particular that we'll come back to time and again. And I hope these are themes that are helpful for your teaching, themes that are crucial for understanding the development of American society, for understanding the development of foreign policy, and most importantly, for understanding the development of the international system as we know it, which is the relationship between societies and cultures and states that we think of when we talk about foreign policy, when we talk about something like the war on terror or the Cold War. It's the system of different societies interacting with one another. The first big theme is a theme I want to try to capture at the start of our discussions, which is the nature of how American society's relationship to this broader world changed in the late 19th century. There is a big myth about American history, the myth we might call of isolation. How many people have used the term isolationism in their teaching, right? There's nothing wrong with using that term. There were people who were identified, usually by their opponents, sometimes by themselves, as being isolationists. And they were generally figures who believed that the United States should have a minimal role in entangling itself, in the words of Washington's farewell address, entangling itself, in these 1796 words, in the alliances and operations of other societies, that we should stay apart, that we should be a city upon a hill and be separate from the corruptions of other societies. That was the general argument that people identified as isolationists made, and it's okay to call them isolationists. But I think the first big theme, and it'll run through our entire week, is that it is absolutely crucial that we understand the United States was never actually isolated from the world. There was never a moment when Americans were separated from global developments. What happened in the late 19th century, what we'll talk about today, is the way in which America's long-standing interaction with other societies became broader, deeper, and more direct than it had ever been before, and in particular, more directly militarized than it had ever been before. But this is not new in the sense that Americans had been interacting with broad contours, broad activities, broad societies outside their borders for a long time. We know that from the story of our own revolution. We know that from the story of the War of 1812. We know that fundamentally because Americans have been traders from the very beginning. And who have they traded with? They have traded with non-Americans, be they Indians on our own territory, members of the Spanish Empire south, Europeans to the west, and Asians, Europeans to the east, Asians to the west. I did my geography right here. So this notion of American isolation is actually a myth in that sense. And one of the big themes that we'll be discussing will be the ways in which Americans have been long connected to broader developments, but the ways those connections changed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that's one big theme. A second theme, a theme that will run through any discussion that we will have about American foreign relations, is the way in which the external interactions affect the internal organization of American politics, and vice versa. There is an interpenetration between the foreign policy and domestic policy making. That's our second big theme, right? That foreign policy and domestic policy are deeply intertwined. And particularly from the late 19th century on, this intertwining, this interdependence grows tighter and tighter. It's impossible to think about a figure like Theodore Roosevelt without connecting his foreign policy and domestic policy. It's impossible to think about a figure like Woodrow Wilson without connecting foreign policy and domestic policy. We tend to separate these things in the ways we organize our newspapers, and sometimes even in the ways we teach, right? But one of the things I think we need to figure out are new ways to connect those things, and that resonates with people today. They see that. Where did Mitt Romney go this last week? He went overseas to politic at home, right? These are deeply interrelated phenomenon. Okay, the third big theme, we have the theme of American interaction and non-isolation. We have the connection between foreign and domestic politics. The third big theme will be power itself. How does American power change? And that's really where and why we start when we're talking about modern American foreign policy, why we start with the late 19th century, because modern American power on the international stage as we know it really begins then. And you will hear in today's lecture a lot of resonances with our own world, not simply because the past resonates with the present, but because there's a particular connection between the late 19th century and today. It is in the late 19th century when American power becomes more connected to military and cultural influence beyond traditional economic influences. If traditionally American interactions with the wider world stemmed around issues of trade and commerce, going back to the 18th century, and some interchange of ideas, the ways in which the Founding Fathers and others interchanged ideas with other societies, now in the late 19th century, the growth of the American economy becomes connected to the growth of American cultural influence and the growth of American military capability. And it is the cultural influence beyond American borders, and it is the military capabilities that are unprecedented. So generally when people say Americans come out of isolation in the late 19th century, what they really are saying is not that Americans were isolated before, but that American power had been less military and less cultural before, had been more economic. Okay? But now the United States becomes a military and cultural player in the way we think of today. If you go almost anywhere in the world today, there are two things you will find, right? Two things you will find almost anywhere in the world. Americans in uniform. We have soldiers on, I think it's 140 bases around the world, right? Well, bases in 140 countries. Most are non-official, not sort of major military bases, but there's an American military presence everywhere. I was just in Germany and Austria the last 2 months. You can't go very far without seeing American servicemen in Germany and Austria, okay? So that's one element of it, right? There's the military power we take for granted today, and cultural influence, right? Is there anyone in the world who doesn't know who Michael Jordan is, or Kobe Bryant, or LeBron James, right? Is there anyone in the world in any major urban area who has not heard a few words of English? Run it the other way. Are there any Americans who have heard any words of Swahili? How many are they? How often do Americans hear non-English languages spoken? How often do non-Americans hear American English spoken? They might not be able to speak English. There are more Spanish and Chinese speakers in the world than there are English speakers, but there are more people who can identify English than any other language in the world. That's part of American cultural influence. That world of an American military presence in 140 countries and that world of American cultural presence begins in the late 19th century. Before the late 19th century, it would have been a joke to tell Europeans or Asians that the United States would be a major cultural influence. We were a backwater. And it would have been a joke to tell them we would have been a major military presence, right? It is in the late 19th century that that story begins. Again, that is not the end of isolation. That is a redefinition of American power. The redefinition of American power that we'll talk about today. So this image that we have up here is, I don't know, can everyone see? Is just an image of Americans actually in Cuba. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is why, in 1898, do American forces end up in occupation, temporarily, of Cuba, but creating a long-term American protectorate, in a sense, over Cuba, and of course a long-term occupation of the Philippines? Why do we get involved in nation building in these places in 1898? And that's related, of course, to these three themes. That's where we'll end today in explaining those events. You cannot understand those wars, you cannot understand those occupations if you don't understand the broader transformations that are going on during this period. So I'll begin with just a list of topics. I'll try to do this with every lecture just so we sort of know where we're going and you can hold me accountable. What will often happen, hopefully not today, is by the time we get to point 3, I'll be rushing really fast. And Wendy will start laughing at me in the back. I want to talk about this third theme I already brought up, power and vulnerabilities. How does the United States become more powerful? What does that mean when we say that? But how does power bring more vulnerability with it, right? This is the Shakespearean side of American history, right? And Shakespeare did understand it all, right? That the more powerful one becomes, the more vulnerable and weak. Every Shakespearean hero, right, is also a victim. Every Shakespearean hero is a victim, right? Not because of moral clairvoyance, but because of the nature of the way in which the system works. The more powerful you are, the more vulnerable you are, the more places you have. In the words of one great British historian, the larger you become, the more toes and fingers you have spread, and therefore the more vulnerable you are to some weaker person chopping off one of your toes or fingers, right? The more dependent you become on the world. That's part of the story of the late 19th century. I want to then talk about this phrase that's used by a very famous military historian, Russell Weigley, called the American way of war. And I want us to look at how Americans develop in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans, foreign policy people, ordinary citizens, a way of thinking about their place in the world that's different, a way in which they think about war and diplomacy and politics in a new way. That doesn't mean they all agree. They don't. But I do believe that people come to think about how things connect in new ways when there is this kind of phase shift in power. What are the new assumptions? What are the unstated ways in which Americans grapple with these new issues? How do Americans think about themselves differently? Or to put it in other terms, what is it that makes someone who talks about foreign policy in 1898 so different from someone who would be talking about it in 1868? Right? You can draw a line from Lincoln to Theodore Roosevelt, but in fact, they're still talking in different languages about power, thinking about American power in different ways. Why is that? And what is this new way of war? And how does it resonate forward to us? And then I want to take us in that context, as we do as historians. Once we've set the context, once we've understood these changes, then I want to walk us through the actual events of the Spanish-American War, of the American occupation of Cuba and the American occupation of the Philippines, and understand how that draws upon these shifts, but also influences these shifts. What I'm doing here is, at least the way I like to think about history, is that you have two things going on at the same time. You have broader shifts that no one person or group of people control. They are broader shifts related to the landscape, related to the economics, related to technology, related to broader phenomenon that no one controls. But those broader shifts do not create inevitable outcomes. Individuals then make decisions about how to inflect those shifts. So to put it in an analogy of our world today, you have a global debt crisis that no one controls, but yet there are big choices people make about what to do in a global debt crisis, what to cut and what not to cut. You had broader shifts in American power and the relationship of American power to that of other societies due to economic change, due to the railroad, which I'll talk about, due to the nature of American society after the Civil War. No one controlled that. But people like William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt and others made choices about how to inflect those shifts. Human beings don't make history as they like, but they do make history nonetheless. That's my derivation on Marx. Right? Marx said it a slightly different way, but that's my derivation on Marx for us. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the changes in American power and vulnerabilities. And a place where historians often start, I'm sure some of you have used this already, is with the World's Fairs of the late 19th century, in particular the Columbian Exposition. I always have trouble with that word, the Columbian Exposition of 1893, which was designed in Chicago to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus's sailing to North America. Now, I always ask smart students, why was it in 1893 if he sailed in 1492? Any thoughts on that?
He didn't get there until 93. I don't know.
Well, he did arrive in 1492. So huh? Okay, he didn't return to Spain until 1890. That is an argument some made at the time. Yes.
It takes a long time to build the World's Fair.
Yes, yes. Actually, the real answer is it was intended to be in 1892, and they didn't get their act together. So they were a year behind. Right, it's important to know that that doesn't only happen in our world. The 1893 Columbian Exposition was designed to showcase a number of things. First of all, it was showcasing Chicago. Chicago was a backwater city until really the 1860s and 1870s. It comes of age with the marrying of new forms of power that are quintessentially American. In the words of Bill Cronin, a very wonderful historian of Chicago, it is the mix of pigs and railroads that makes Chicago. By the late 19th century, more hogs are being slaughtered in Chicago than any other city. And one thing we have to remember is what a city like Chicago would have smelled like at the time. Our cities are now sanitized, right? Or if they smell of, well, things that people are smoking for various reasons. They don't actually smell of the food that people are making in the same way. The city actually was a place that, with railroad technology and the creation of a modern integrated economy on a size that no other society had at that time, Americans were able to move more agricultural product from west to Chicago, and in Chicago prepare it for manufacture and export elsewhere. Why Chicago? Because of Chicago's position on Lake Michigan and because of its role as a hub for all the Western Branch railway lines. Okay? No other society, it sounds so strange now to say, no other society in the late 19th century had more railroad stock than the United States. No society was building it faster, no society had more of it. That seems so strange a century later when we have no railroads, right, of any real kind to speak of for at least non-commercial heavy travel. And no other society had as much land that was in agricultural use, producing as much that could be manufactured as quickly and efficiently as the United States. What the Civil War did, and Reconstruction after the Civil War, was create an integrated, single continental economy. The railroad provided the sinew, provided the transportation. Chicago and other hubs, what Bill Cronin calls nature's metropolis, right? These cities became places, right, where the agricultural product was brought in, capital value was added to it, and it was sent out. That is not how traditional European cities were built. And that's why American cities look so different. Chicago does not look like any city in Europe. It is a city designed for the movement of goods in and the movement of goods out. And the modern manifestation of that for all of us is O'Hare Airport, right? And the highway system around the city as such. Now, the great white city that was produced at the Columbian Exposition was designed to show off the modernity of Chicago. World's fairs in the late 19th century were a big deal. They occurred in Paris, in London, in Berlin, and in the United States and elsewhere. And they were designed, World's fairs, to showcase the new technology, to showcase the new economies, to showcase the new worlds that were coming into existence. They were the South by Southwests of their time, right? Here's where all the great thinkers about economy and technology would come together. And the Columbian Exposition marked America's arrival. Historians point to this moment because you can see the architectural imagery of it. You can see the material elements of it there. A number of things. It was the first time that a major part of an urban area was lit with electricity at night. So the city was not just white, it was light. And it was Thomas Edison who was responsible for that. It was designed to mix, and if you've been to Washington, D.C., if you've been to Chicago, if you've been to New York, you recognize the similarity in buildings built in those cities at the same time, the neoclassical aspirations of the United States, right? All the monuments that we think of in Washington, D.C., the New York Public Library, Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Art Institute in Chicago, right? All of these wonderful neoclassical buildings, right? The United States, to some extent, as a new Rome, able to produce on a scale that could rival something like Rome. And the Great White City also showcased a whole variety of Western elements of American society. Across the street was Buffalo Bill performing Western shows for visitors. The Columbian Exposition was designed to show that the United States had arrived as an international player, but a different kind. Chicago, electricity, Buffalo Bill. We were not like other societies, but we had arrived as one of the major players. And if you look at the coverage, the news coverage, which has been analyzed in depth by historians, I don't think there's a newspaper article written about the Columbian Exposition that historians have not analyzed in depth. Basically, what you find is that people around the world are making this exact point. Wow, the United States has arrived. The United States is a player, but it's not the same kind. More commercial emphasis. So much more. So much more. So much more. Not more sophistication. Actually, people laughed at Buffalo Bill from other societies. There were all sorts of anthropological exhibits, and for British abolitionists and others who came over, it was strange, American racial views. They were struck and commented time and again on the ways in which the great white city seemed to throw back to an early 19th century view of race. So people did not come saying Americans were more sophisticated intellectually. They came and saw the degree to which the United States was able to produce. The United States had arrived as an economic power, and that there was a modernity about it, that there was new technology, new capability that had come together here. this was a moment of self-conscious American assertion. American levels of trade in the late 19th century approached levels they would never reach again until the 1970s, which is to say the proportion of American product that was traded as a proportion of total production was larger at this point than it would be later. And the period when tariffs were raised in the 1920s and 30s, it would take till the 1970s for the proportion of American product to equal what it was then, and the proportion of trade for other societies was greater than it was again until the 1970s. This was a period of booming international trade. That doesn't mean everyone was getting wealthy, but it means more product was being traded as a proportion of total product. Now, again, I want to make it clear that was still a very small proportion of American total trade, probably in the 3 to 4 to 5% range, or we don't know for certain. But it was still more than had ever been traded before, and it was more than Americans would trade until the post-war period as a proportion of their economy. Okay, the period after World War I is actually a period of high tariffs. This was a period of lower tariffs, in fact, for a time. It's a complicated story because tariffs then go up again, and what is protected and what is not is very complicated. One of the key points that I like to make when I talk about tariffs and trade is that Americans have always been a high tariff society, not a low tariff society. Even in this period when American trade is increasing, we are not a free trade society, which is to say the tariff on trade is still quite high. There are protectionist measures that are used to allow American industry to do what it's doing in Chicago and elsewhere. In fact, that's the Republican Party program, Protect Industry, right? William McKinley makes his name, actually, with the famous McKinley tariff of the early 1890s. Protection on trade is actually as American as free trade is. In fact, before the income tax, right, in the early 20th century, the major source of American revenue for the federal government is tariffs, right? So that's why this history is complicated, right? This is a period of growing international trade, but it's still a period of high tariffs. The tariffs get even higher after World War I, in particular in the Depression, but this is still a period of tariffs. More trade, but continued tariffs. The levels of trade increase for the U.S., but they're even larger for other societies, and that's actually part of the point. As other societies are trading more, they look to the United States now more than they ever do before. The United States is becoming also a major capital accumulation society, which is to say the United States becomes, because of its production, a society with a high positive balance of trade, which produces surplus cash in the American economy, which gets invested in the old world. It is at this moment, and you can see the money and investment that's put into Chicago, it is at this moment that the United States becomes a net lender to other societies, as it will remain until the post-World War II period, right? And when we talk about World War I, we'll talk a bit about how the United States is actually financing, through its loans, both sides in the war, right? This is a period of American net lending abroad, again, because the United States is producing so much more, others are buying it in higher proportions than ever before, and that cash then is flowing into the American economy, right? Not into everyone in the American economy, but into the hands of bankers and others who are able to use that cash to actually invest abroad. One of the conflicts in American society, coming to our theme about how domestic and international relate, is what should happen with that surplus capital, right? The way to understand free silver and William Jennings Bryan is to understand that debate. What William Jennings Bryan is arguing in 1896, right, is that the United States economy is producing a lot of cash. But the cash, because of the gold standard, right, is moving into the hands, right, into the hands of bankers, not into the hands of farmers. The farmers are sending their goods into Chicago and elsewhere. They're getting paid for their goods. But their problem is, right, the more they produce, the less they get. It's the problem with farming at this time, right? It's the problem always with farming, right? It's as close to a perfectly competitive economy as you come, right? So the more corn out there, the less you get for your corn, right? So you don't actually get more by producing more in terms of the cost to produce and what you get out of your production. So as the United States is producing more, farmers are being squeezed more, but those who are getting the farm goods into Chicago and elsewhere and sending them out, they're making more money, And that's how you get high amounts of cash to produce neoclassical beautiful buildings and great philanthropy in urban areas, and how you have agricultural poverty in some places, right? Farmers can't pay their mortgages, whereas bankers have more cash than they've ever had before. William Jennings Bryan's argument, the free silver argument, is not a crazy argument at all. The free silver argument is an argument that there actually has to be a way to monetize the production of farmers, to allow farmers to have access to more cash. And you do that by allowing there to be more cash in the economy, by basing your currency not just on gold, but basing it on silver as well. Okay, that's the argument William Jennings Bryan is making. It's directly related to these foreign policy issues that we're talking about here. Now, why do the bankers and others in places like Chicago not want to go to free silver? It's not just because they're greedy. Of course they're greedy. But it's not just because they're greedy. Everyone's greedy, right? It's not just because they're greedy. It's because their trade is dependent upon having a consistent, reliable currency. And their loans are only worth something if that currency remains consistent. The nightmare for someone who has a lot of money is inflation, right? Because then that money becomes worthless, right? So it's not that the bankers in Chicago and the Montgomery Wards in Chicago are bad people. They might be, they might not be. It's that their interest in this global trade environment is to have currency as tight as possible, as well controlled as possible, and as clearly demarked to gold as possible at this time. That protects their value, it protects their trade, it protects their loans. For the farmers, the argument is just the opposite. They want more cash available, so their mortgages become less expensive, and so it becomes less expensive to buy seed for their crop, right? So that's what the debate over free silver really is. And that's why you get this stark argument at this time. It is a function of the growth of American power and the growth of American international interactions at this time that makes that domestic debate so significant. Another important debate from this period, as you know, is the debate about infrastructure, the debate about domestic development. As I said, the railroad is key. You cannot think about Chicago without the railroad for the 19th century, just as you can't think about it today without the airport, right? It is the railroad that provides the connection, the sinews of a national economy for the United States. But the big debate, of course, is over who should control interstate commerce. The Constitution is vague on this, right? Where does interstate commerce fall? How should it be regulated? And what you see in the late 19th century is you see the federal government, in large part because of the money it's making on the tariffs on American trade, investing on a large scale in domestic infrastructure as it had not before. And it's ironic, it's a different party from today. It is actually the Republican Party that's doing this. The Republican Party program is to use federal money to invest in infrastructural development. In fact, this had been a long-time Lincolnian argument of the Republican Party. It had actually been an argument going back to the Whigs before there was a Republican Party, right? Who is it who creates the land grants for state universities? Abraham Lincoln, the Morrill Act, Republican Party, right? It is the Republican Party that's pushing for infrastructural development. It is in this period that the Republican Party begins to invest much more in that. And it is also in this period that the federal government, through the Republican Party, will become much more involved in land management as well. Managing railroad, managing roads, managing commerce, but also managing leisure and protecting, in TR's words, leisure. This is Neil's area, not mine, but it's not surprising that it is someone like Theodore Roosevelt, right, a believer in this, someone who's following this story, who also wants to set aside public land for parks and the wilderness. He wants to do what we're seeing here, to marry production and capability with the strenuous life, to marry the virtues of the frontier, as Frederick Jackson Turner talks about them, with the capabilities of a new economy. That's what this discussion is all about. And that's also why it's a very racist discussion, right? Because it's an image of a white settler. It's an image of a white male settler who's now become a factory owner, right? Who's now become wealthy from production. And the question is, how do we maintain our pioneer virtues and at the same time become productive on this scale? That's the debate. That's the discussion that's going on here. American economic and technological capability also gets connected to military power as well, and it happens initially through the sea, not through the land. Because we're a continental society with few serious threats on the continent after the Civil War, the focus of defense is really on two areas, right? One is the Army, which comes of age after the Civil War as a frontier army fighting the remnants of Indians, right? And then the Navy, which is designed in this period to protect commerce, right? And the United States will use its economic power and technological capability to develop a world-class Navy. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. A world-class Navy out of this to protect this. And there are all kinds of reasons why that will be the case. What people coming to the Columbian Exposition in 1893 see is not an American military power that threatens them in Europe, but an American society that has the capability now to trade on the scale it hasn't before, and the capability to protect and assert its own trade as it had not before. Just one other way of thinking about this. Before the Civil War, the United States did not even have foreign diplomats. Right? You all know that. There was no foreign service. When you were sent abroad, as Ben Franklin was famously, right, as John Quincy Adams was time and again, you were sent abroad, if you weren't Secretary of State, you were sent abroad as a special minister, which actually meant if you were the American special minister to the Court of St. James, to London, as Charles Francis Adams was, John Quincy Adams's son, the father of Henry Adams, the grandson of John Adams. If you were in London, as Charles Francis Adams was during the Civil War, you were there as an American minister. You were not there as a full ambassador. So therefore, you had the lowest rank in the court. All the other ambassadors had rank above you. Americans didn't believe in ambassadors, right? Ambassadors are aristocratic. Ambassadors are people who make deals behind people's backs. We don't do that, right? We don't do that sort of thing. It's only after the Civil War, under the administration of Ulysses Grant and Hamilton Fish as Secretary of State, that the United States creates its first foreign service. And it's only in this period that the foreign service really begins to come of age. It's still pathetic. Well, it's pathetic to some extent still today, too. But it's particularly pathetic then. It's small. It gets very little support. There's very little training. But this begins to become an area where intelligent Americans, well-trained, with a lot of thought, go in to find careers. Foreign policy and naval policy, interrelated, become important parts of this story. This is a new American society. It's an American society, ladies and gentlemen, that also has many new vulnerabilities now. This is, again, the Shakespearean part of American power. As the United States is trading more, it is also, therefore, dependent more on markets abroad than before. Now, this can be overstated. As you probably know, one of the big debates among historians is the extent to which the United States became captured by the interest in foreign markets in the late 19th century. William Appleman Williams, who had actually been my predecessor at the University of Wisconsin, had made the argument famously that the open door drove American foreign policy, the desire to open markets, which explains American expansion, he argued. Others argued no, it didn't, because it was still, even though it was a growing part of American trade, it was still a small part of American trade. Americans really didn't need it. Right? You could think about it in the way we talk about oil today. I mean, we do need foreign oil, but in fact, we need foreign oil far less than most of our allies do. We could actually get along pretty well with a major depletion of oil access for our society because of our own reserves. It's more other societies, our friends, who need the oil much more than we do. Same sort of argument could be made about the late 19th century. I think what's crucial is not to necessarily take a position on this, but to recognize that the vulnerability Americans had was not that the foreign trade could bankrupt the United States if cut off, but it was now a more important part of the equation. It was something that Americans had to care about in a way they had not cared about it before. If you were in Chicago, you sure wanted to make sure you could continue to trade. And you have, in the reader, you have John Hay's open door notes, and you can see him making this argument, that the United States wants to have access to other societies, but in fact, it's not simply because of the immediate payoff. It's because it's part now of the equation. You trade more, even if it's not crucial to your lifeblood, it becomes more important to you, right? It's there. It's a new dependence that the United States has that it did not have before. Another vulnerability the United States has is that people begin to react against this kind of influence that we see in Chicago. There is, among Europeans in particular, a desire to keep American influence out, to keep the barbarians at the gate. Americans face cultural resistance for the first time, and this will be a story of the 20th century, well beyond that, right? If the story of the 19th century was foreigners thinking Americans were provincial bumpkins, right? Famously, Gladstone says that Lincoln, right, is this frontier bully. That's how he thinks of him as, right? By the 20th century, the United States will confront time and again people who feel they have to defend themselves against American cultural influence. And American cultural influence is too great. They'll feel that there's too much of it coming in on them. We've all had those conversations with people from other societies, right? Every society's movie industry, if they have one left, struggles every day to keep Hollywood at bay to some extent, right? Every society struggles to do that, right? Well, that begins to happen in the late 19th century. That begins to become a concern societies have. They react against what they see as the excessive businessness of American society, the excessive materialism of American society. Americans confront cultural resistance, which they hadn't really confronted before because they didn't matter in the same way before. People don't resist you culturally if they don't think your culture is threatening or matters to them in any way. Now it becomes more of a big issue. And then the third and perhaps most important area of American vulnerability is in fact military vulnerability during this period. And this is part of the story that's often not told. It's not that the United States is under threat of being attacked. It's not that the United States is under threat of being invaded in this period. Not at all. Americans are remarkably secure in that sense. But it is that American commerce now and American economic interests are more vulnerable than they have been before. As you invest overseas, as you trade overseas, it's not just that you need those markets, it's also that you need security for your investments. Americans, to put it very plainly, become in the late 19th century property owners in Latin America and in Europe and elsewhere on a scale they had not been before. And as property owners, owning plantations if you're United Fruit, owning investments in companies if you're JP Morgan, you have an interest in protecting that. And one of the big themes I'll try to stress throughout our time is that investors and business people, they actually don't want war. What they want is stability. They often will support war if they think it'll make stability, but they don't actually want war. They want stability. They want security for their investments. And the United States does not, in the late 19th century, have commensurate military power to secure its interests overseas. It does not have the commensurate military power. Who is it who enforces the Monroe Doctrine, which keeps new colonies out of Latin America at this time? It's Great Britain, right? Who is it that insures most of American shipping? Great Britain. Who is it who carries a large proportion of American shipping? Great Britain. The United States is deeply dependent upon Britain and other societies to secure American access. This even applies to technology. The first underwater international cables, I don't actually know if they're American cables, the first underwater international cables for telegraphic communication that are created, right? They do not actually run from Latin America to the US. They run from Latin America to Britain to the US. The hubs are in Europe for the technology because that's, again, where the security is. That's where the force is. It's the military that's building these things. So the United States is militarily punching under its weight on an international scale. And this becomes a problem as in the late 19th century. Here's where global history matters. There are more and more major societies trying to compete for access to markets, for access to resources, and most of all, for control over capital. Right? This is the exact same period of the growth of a united Germany. This is the exact same period as the growth of a modernizing, rapidly modernizing Japan. Germany and Japan come on as major international players, more powerful than they've been before. Britain is still a major player. France is too. Spain is to some extent. It is a crowded world. And Americans, I think, legitimately see problems of being unable to secure their investments abroad. Again, it's not about being attacked at home. It's about securing your investments abroad. And that is a real issue, right? It can be over-exaggerated, but it is a real issue at this time. Okay, this sort of broad set of tectonics, these broad shifts, gets us to then our second point that I wanted to talk about and hopefully spend a little more time on, which is the sort of American way of war and diplomacy in the 1890s. What do we mean by that? An important figure for us here is Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose influence probably can't be overstated. It can be overstated in terms of daily policymaking, but as a whole, he's a major figure in articulating a way of thinking about these issues that we've just discussed. How many people have heard of Alfred Thayer Mahan before? Great, great. He's someone I hope you can bring into your classroom because I think telling his story, I'm a believer in biographies, by the way. I've written one, obviously I have to believe in one. But writing biography is a way, I think, sometimes of connecting these broader trends to real life decision making for students so they can sort of understand what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about Alfred Thayer Mahan. He was a child of Dennis Hart Mahan, who had been involved with really what was the major American and only American military academy to speak of on a large scale in the early 19th century, which would be West Point, founded, of course, by Thomas Jefferson. And Dennis Hart Mahan was, like most people who were trained in that context, he was an engineer. If you were a military thinker, if you were a military professional, you were an engineer. It was engineering that you did. You built forts, you built harbor security, you did that sort of work. That's what military science was. It was engineering. And to this day, West Point is a major engineering school in that sense. He was also the grandchild of a minister in New York City and was a deep believer in the American mission in the world. So he has this sort of military background and he has this religious missionary background. And he becomes, like many other young men, young ambitious men, he becomes an officer at a very young age during the Civil War. Lincoln must make many people into officers very quickly, as he must quickly expand the Union Army and then try to find, it takes a long time, a general who can actually command the Union Army. And he becomes, Alfred Thayer Mahan becomes an officer in the Navy. And the Navy is an important part of the Civil War story. It was probably not fair for me to say that the Navy really gets begun on a large scale in the late 19th century. True naval historians would say it's really Civil War when you see the Union Navy operating on a great scale, in particular in the blockade of the Southern Confederacy. Right? One of the key things that the Union wants to do is make sure that the Confederates cannot sell their cotton. Right? Because if they can sell their cotton, they have an endless source of cash. Right? They also want to make sure they don't develop a navy. And the Confederacy tried to buy a navy, buy major navy ships from Great Britain. A lot of this story doesn't get told because we get so focused on Antietam and Gettysburg and things like that. But the international element of this is really significant. We will come back to this during World War I, by the way. You cannot understand World War I if you don't understand the naval blockade of the Civil War. It's a crucial issue in U.S.-Britain relations when we get to World War I as well. Mahan becomes a Navy officer in this context, but then he suffers from what officers often suffer from after war, which is being furloughed. Right? It doesn't only happen to teachers. After the Civil War, there's a big problem. Big, big problem. Right? Too many officers, not enough seamen and soldiers. And too many officers and not enough uses for them. What does the United States do after the Civil War? It cuts the military budget drastically. Right? This is a pattern in American society. And Mahan finds himself an underemployed Navy officer. His pay is stagnant. In fact, it goes down in real terms. There's no mission. And he's sent at one point on a Navy ship down to Chile, off the coast of Chile. And not only does he feel underpaid and isolated, sitting at sea off the coast of Chile, but he recognizes actually that the Chileans are investing more in their ships than the United States is. He's embarrassed, in fact, that the Chileans are developing a better Navy. This is in the 1870s, 1880s, than the United States is. He comes back and decides that there's something that needs to be done about this. And it is he and a number of other naval officers who are able to convince the Secretary of War to find, the Secretary of Navy, Navy and War are separate at this point, so it's the Secretary of Navy, convinces him to establish what becomes the Naval War College, which will be an advanced educational area for Navy officers, for postgraduate education for Navy officers who've already come through Annapolis and have experience in the field. And he becomes one of the first lecturers there and writes a book, which is one of the most influential books of the late 19th century, called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And you can still get it. It's worth, there are parts of it, you could even excerpt parts of it for students. It's still available in paperback, printed by the Navy Press, of course, available for you. It's a work of history. It's about 400 pages. Almost all of it is about the past. He looks at two examples of great societies, Rome and Great Britain. And his argument is that these societies became wealthy, they became free, and they became strong because of, big surprise, a strong navy. That the problem was for their adversaries, be it Hannibal or be it the various British adversaries, the French, the Spanish, and others, that they had strong armies. But strong armies, Mahan argued, are undemocratic. Strong armies are not wealth-creating. They're wealth-absorbing, and strong armies do not, in the long run, win wars. That it's navies. Mahan argued that the Navy was the appropriate partner for a more powerful nation because the Navy could bring security over distance without the problems of over-militarization, that the Navy could be efficient, that the Navy could be mobile, that the Navy could do for the sea what pioneers did for the frontier, that the Navy could provide security in an efficient, democratic way. He argued, in fact, that navies don't make coups. That's actually not true, right? Everyone knows the Russian Revolution was actually created by a coup of sailors. But that was 1917. He didn't know that was going to happen yet, right? He argued that armies are the ones. It's generals in armies. It's the McClellans, right, who threaten democratic governance. They have men under arms. They get angry at their political leaders, and they march and take control of government centers. Navies, well, they're at sea. They can't do that, he argued. Navies, he argued, give you position. Mahan argued that the United States needed a strategy, some will later call it a grand strategy, for securing access through freedom of maneuver to protect trade without becoming a tyrannical empire in other societies. That the United States would move and provide access, but it would not provide long-term occupation. And the vision Mahan had was of a world of American activity through what would later be called choke points, that's the Cold War term, what he would call coaling stations, where the United States would have key bases around the world where it could send its force, send its ships, in this period, recoal them, resupply them, and then send them to an area of emergency. They would be an over-the-horizon, that's another Cold War term, an over-the-horizon capability. They would not be in people's faces, but they would be available to protect American interest when necessary. And to do this, he argued, you needed a large, well-trained Navy. He believed all sailors in a time when people were moving to steam engines, and they were moving away from traditional coal, and they were moving toward the use of gasoline and other more modern forms of shipping. He believed they had to be trained in traditional sailing methods, but they had to bring these sailing methods together with a new strategic vision. That the Navy had to be large, that the Navy had to be maneuverable, it had to be well-trained, it had to be elitist, and it had to be white. That it was going to be composed of the cream of the crop of American officers. And that this was a way to do it. He had many readers, many who were deeply influenced by him. One, of course, you can see where we're going, was a man named Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt believed that this was, in some ways, the perfect match of a pioneering spirit with a world power. That it was for TR and others a vision of how the United States could be powerful but still democratic, how the United States could spread its influence, but spread its influence without creating the blood and tyranny that other societies had brought, how the United States could be benevolent and white and bring civilization to the world without, at the same time, jeopardizing its own values at home. And this is where Theodore Roosevelt got the idea of the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet is designed to show the world that the United States can do this. Mahan's ideas were not just read in the United States. They were deeply influential in other parts of the world. In Germany, they had a deep influence on the Kaiser and Admiral Tirpitz. And it is at this period that the Germans begin to build a large navy, larger than the American Navy, to try to challenge Britain naval supremacy. The argument Mahan makes is crucially influential. It has two key elements to it that are new to the United States. Obviously, a larger navy is new, but you could argue there was some of that, some precedent for that in the Civil War. But two other things. Mahan's vision is not about colonies, but it is about what he calls forward bases. Forward bases. This vision only works if you can get your ships to different places. You've got to have ships you can get to China when there's a Boxer Rebellion, which there will be soon, right? You've got to get ships you can get to Japan when you want to force open a market there, as Perry did, right? You've got to have ships you can get to Egypt, right, when there's a crisis in Egypt. They don't have to be there, but they have to be close enough. They have to have bases. They have to be key strategic locations around the world that you have access to. So forward bases. And those are going to be far from the United States, not close. So this is not a debate over whether to move into Cuba per se, or whether to move into Nicaragua, or move into Mexico. This is not about continental expansion anymore. This is not about colonies either. It's about bases overseas. Second element that's new about it, that's perhaps even more important than the basis, is that you've got to be ready to operate in foreign terrain and have a permanent knowledge capability as well as a naval capability, right? You've got to know who you're interacting with. You've got to know who you're working with. You've got to study other societies. This, I would argue, is the real beginning of the study of foreign societies by the United States in an academic context. It begins with the military. There were always American experts on other societies, but they were not really trained to be experts. They became experts because they were usually gentlemen who developed an interest in a foreign society or had a relational interest through family with a foreign society. Now there's an emphasis on training people to understand foreign societies. If you're going to be operating in Asia, you now need to be trained. This is well ahead of where the Foreign Service is on these issues. And the Navy, not surprisingly, develops the first intelligence agency in the United States. It is the Office of Naval Intelligence. And by the way, it is the Office of Naval Intelligence that is the main intelligence element of American society all the way up to World War II. During World War II, Roosevelt creates the Office of Strategic Studies, the OSS, as a new intelligence agency, and then the OSS becomes the CIA. And now we have about 16 of these that we know of, and probably another 16 we don't even know of, right, that are doing all sorts of intelligence work. But until 1941, 42, the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, is the main place that's doing this. And some of that is the kind of spook stuff, but most of it is actually the intensive study of foreign societies. That's what intelligence work is, to this day, too. The majority of it is learning languages and understanding foreign societies and trying to anticipate what's happening in foreign societies. That really begins here. And there was no American capacity on any major government scale for doing that before. Mahan's ideas are deeply influential because he's lucky. He persuades, but he also benefits from this moment. He benefits from the growing American wealth. He benefits from the insecurity surrounding that wealth, especially as the American economy continues to go through boom and bust cycles, right? America's getting wealthier, but it's also going through these continual boom and bust cycles. And there's more and more concern about the international side of this. So he's able to get a hearing in this sense. Why do ideas get picked up by policymakers? Not because they're the best ideas. It's never because they're the best ideas. It's because they're the right ideas at the right moment for what seem to be the problems they confront at that moment. Right? That's really what it is. And these ideas insert themselves at this very time into American thinking. And what it develops, I would argue, now this is my interpretation, this is not what Mahan says, but I would argue that the Mahanian way of thinking becomes central to the American aspiration in the late 19th century to be an international power of a different kind. And this is something I was trying to talk about in my book on nation building, that Americans have a long-standing desire to see the world organized in a way in which American interests are served, but where the United States does not have to manage it itself, right? It's in some ways Thomas Jefferson's deist idea of a self-organizing world. It's federalism on a broad sense. In the late 19th century, this becomes married, this vision, I think, of a world of nation states, a world of self-governing entities, where the people rule themselves, but rule themselves in the right way. This vision of a world of nation states gets married now to an interventionist capability. And the vision is that Americans will have to intervene at certain moments to make this a reality and then pull out. And the Mahanian promise is that the Navy can do this for you. That you can go in and solve a problem as a police force, get a society on the right track, and then get out, right? There is no place in Mahan's vision for a colonial service. This is a really important point. The British, the Russians, the Germans, the Japanese, all of the other societies at this point are increasing their colonial services. They're increasing the number of people they train to actually occupy other societies, people trained to do this. The United States never does that because the idea is not to be a colonizer. The idea is to be an intervener when necessary, but be an intervener to get societies going the right way and then pull out. That's not necessarily better. It's just different, it seems to me. You can call it imperialist if you want. You cannot call it imperialist. I don't think it really matters how we label it. I think what's more important is how we describe it, right? And it's what I see as the American nation building vision at this time, or it's what we could also call an effort to intervene, but also an effort to intervene to remain separate, right? The whole Mahanian vision is that you're there, you're flexible, but you're not permanently there. You're moving, right? And I would argue it connects to what we'll talk about later, which is a developmental vision. The vision that the United States has ideas, has the truth about development, for how other societies develop, and that we will help them with the hand of the military, as well as cultural influence, economic aid, etc., to develop the right way so they can rule themselves and, of course, serve our interests at the same time. It's not there yet in those terms, but that's part of where it's going. Bill?
Yeah, are these ideas like designed in any way to have like some kind of exceptionalist appeal, or is it just utilitarian way?
I think it's both. It's a great question. I think the language is deeply exceptionalist. The language is very much about how the United States is different, how the United States has this pioneering experience, how the United States is opposed to empires. When Mahan writes about the influence of sea power upon history, he's not saying the United States should be like Rome or Britain. He's saying we should learn from Rome and Britain. So there's an exceptionalist belief. There's a sense of mission. But I think there's also this utilitarian element to it. And I like the way you put that. They're both there, and I don't think you can separate them. I mean, in the end, I don't think in history there's really any altruism. I don't actually know if there's any altruism in the world. I think people do things because it's in their interest, but that doesn't mean they're doing bad things. Good things, morality can be in people's interests. A moral vision can be in people's interests. But I don't think there's ever, I don't think there's any part of this that's not utilitarian. But to say that there's a utilitarianism to it doesn't mean there isn't a serious missionary element to it as well. I've forgotten your first name. I'm sorry. Earl.
How did racism play into this view of setting these societies in order and then leaving? I mean,
Sure. There's definitely a presumption, first of all, that the United States has developed the right way to do it. And Mahan's history is teleological. It leads to the United States, right? Rome, Britain, the United States. He forgets a lot of things along the lines. You know, many have read it and said, well, there was this place called China, wasn't there? And they had a great civilization that lasted a long time. And they intentionally did not create a navy, right? They truly did isolate themselves. And, you know, they had a pretty good run for about 500 years, right? More than that, in fact. So, yeah, there's that part of it. And then, of course, there's the presumption that other peoples are not ready to rule themselves. And we'll talk about that in a second. This is a really sticky one, right? Because there's a lot of racism freighted on it. And this is a hard thing to talk about. We all need to figure this out. There's also, there are societies that aren't ruling themselves well. So how do you talk about that? It's talked about in a racist way. We have to ask ourselves, I think, as scholars, as policymakers, as teachers, how should we talk about that, right? I look at a place like Syria today, and I don't want to say we know better. I don't want to say they can't rule themselves because of who they are. But I also don't want to say that they can rule themselves just if we leave them alone. That's not what's going to happen. So this is the complicated part of it. At this time, these discussions are heavily freighted with race. And the Japanese are an interesting part of it because they're made, and many scholars have written about this, they're made kind of half white during this period, right? Because the Japanese seem to be able to do what Asians can't do. That's the curious thing about racism, how people who are racist can rationalize particular groups within that. Other questions? I've been talking too much. Other questions? I'll go on to Cuba and the Philippines, but we'll have plenty of time for questions. And if there aren't questions, I'll just call on you. So it doesn't matter. Wendy, you're staying awake back there? So let's talk. Oh, sorry. So the wars of 1898 to 1902. This is the context for these wars. Again, what I'm trying to do here is, in addition to talking about what I think is the interesting research and material, giving a sense of how I think at least historians, as scholars, and maybe as teachers, talk about big events, right? What we're really talking about is the War of 1898, whatever we want to call it, and what happens then. But how are we going to talk about it? How do we understand what's going on there? What's the significance of it? Where does it come from? What are the broader structures? What are the reasons why people make the decisions they make, right? And that's all about these changes in power and vulnerabilities and these changes in ideas that then take us to this moment of crisis, right? The ideas are there, the changes are there, then the crisis happens, and what do policymakers do? They're entrepreneurs. They grab what they can to solve their problem. And what happens? What happens in Cuba? Well, what does not happen is probably what we should talk about first. Americans do not wake up one day and say, we are so powerful, we're going to go into Cuba. That's not what happens. Nor do Americans wake up one day and say, oh, it's so bad what's happening, let's go help the Cubans. Neither of those things happen. In fact, that's usually not how wars occur. Okay? Wars rarely have a moment of clairvoyant decision making. Okay? Pearl Harbor is the exception in so many ways. Okay? What happens in Cuba is something very different. In 1869, Cuba goes into a period of prolonged civil war. It's a consequence of a number of things. It's a consequence of the Spanish Empire becoming less and less capable of managing this part of their empire because of their lack of money, their lack of technology, their lack of trained colonial representatives. It's part also of the growing population on the island. And if you know a little bit about Cuban history, you know how interesting and complex the population of Cuba is. You have Afro-Cubans, you have Spanish Cubans, and you have many mixes in between. You also have two economies in Cuba, right? You have a sugar economy and you have a tobacco economy, right? So it's an incredibly complicated landscape. We could talk more about that. But the key point is from 1869 through the 1890s, there is turmoil here 90 miles from the coast of Florida. And this is turmoil that creates an immediate American interest. A, because much of the sugar and tobacco is being exported to the U.S., and in fact, many Americans own some of the sugar and tobacco. This is, of course, a long-time Cuban complaint, and Americans are buying up their resources. So there's that. But there's also the immigration issue, right? As there are problems in Cuba, they literally spill over in terms of people into the U.S. You could argue that it is from the end of the Civil War till today that Cuba has played an enormous role in American politics. And that's because American society is responsive, right, to people who come into this society and voice themselves, right? And Cubans are able to do that. They're able to gain sympathizers in the United States. Many of the early Cuban revolutionaries raise money in New York City. Castro will follow their steps in the 1950s, go to wealthy New Yorkers and raise money from them for a revolution in Cuba. Most Americans support revolution in Cuba. There are very few Americans who want to support the Spanish Empire in Cuba. Very few Americans, though, want to get involved in the military affairs or political affairs on the island. Very few Americans. There are some. If you want to go back and find them, you can find individuals in the 1870s and 80s who are saying we should go into Cuba, but they are a distinct minority. There is no one of any seriousness in the 1870s and 80s who's saying the United States should go in and invade Cuba. And in fact, the question would have been how and why and what are we going to do? People were concerned about it, but they sort of wanted the Spanish to handle it, or they wanted the Cubans to handle it. The hope was that somehow, slowly, this would evolve into a more stable situation. It became much worse in the late 1880s and 1890s. The level of violence increases. The Spanish Empire is less and less capable of maintaining order. It tries to reform. This is very important. The Spanish Empire becomes less repressive, gives more local control, puts more money in. They tried to reform in the early 1890s, but as we all know, you reach a point in a society, and we don't know exactly when, why, and how, but you reach a point where the reform only fuels the demands for more, right? The legitimate demands for more. This is the Tocqueville explanation for the French Revolution, right? The French Revolution occurred when France was getting less oppressive, not more. People's expectations rose in a time when they were getting more reform. The same sort of thing happens in Cuba in the early 1890s. It is important to note that President Grover Cleveland, time and again, when the issue comes to his desk in the late 1880s, says no, the United States will not intervene. Time and again, when asked to intervene by certain Cuban revolutionary groups, when certain elements of American politics, minority groups, ask for American intervention, the president says no, with broad acclamation. So there is no deep desire to get into Cuba at this point. In 1898, though, the equation changes. Now, we've long pointed to the role of yellow journalism and all of this, and there is some of that. Of course, that matters. William Randolph Hearst was one of the people who thought the United States should go into Cuba and made a story out of it. But actually, what really changes are two things. First, other societies outside of Spain become interested in this part of the world. The Germans and the British in particular. They had long had interests the British had in this area. The Germans were trying to develop interests in this area. Their rivalry increased both of their actions in this area. But then one other really important thing happens. Oil, right, is found in Mexico. And the interests of oil and other issues in Mexico are driving more foreign, in this case, read European, empires into this region. So there's a concern that actually there are more players coming in here. And this will be a concern for Wilson with the Mexican Revolution. The reason Wilson will intervene in Mexico 20 years later is for this very reason, right? So there's concern about other powers in the region. It's a more competitive world. And second, then, there is the concern that as American economic interests are increasing, and there's more demand for the sugar and tobacco from Cuba, more trade around this area, that instability is becoming more and more of a problem. It's more and more of a problem as the United States is doing more and more of the trading in this area. Those two variables become very, very important for William McKinley. McKinley decides, following the advice of others who have been influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan, he decides that he is not going to go to war in Cuba, but he's going to try to now do something to try to bring stability. And he doesn't have an aid agency, and he doesn't know who to give aid to, and he didn't think in those terms. But he has now a slightly bigger navy. So he sends the USS Maine, famously, off the coast of Cuba. And the idea is a classic Mahanian move. This is the first place you can show Mahan's direct influence, that the Navy will show power, and that by the Americans sitting off the coast there, it will keep the Spanish disciplined, it'll hopefully appease some of the Cuban revolutionaries, and the United States can play a kind of mediating role. That's what McKinley wanted to do. He wanted to mediate a settlement that would bring some kind of stability to Cuba, hopefully a little more democratic, but he didn't really care about that. He wanted Cuba to be stable. He wanted this problem to go away, and he wanted to make sure that the Germans or the British didn't mediate, right? You could see why he wouldn't want them to mediate this problem. Of course, once the USS Maine is sitting off Havana, it also becomes a target, right? It also becomes a target. And when the Maine blows up, and on February 15th, 1898, and 266 American soldiers die in the explosion, the assumption immediately is that the Spanish were responsible for this. Now, we know after years of study and investigation that it's highly likely, in fact, this was an internal combustion engine problem that blew up, that it was a problem in the engine room, not terrorism as such, not a foreign power. But McKinley didn't know that at the time. He didn't manufacture that. He reacted with the presumption that this happened because the Spanish had blown up the ship. And he had every reason to think that at the time. The Spanish were not happy the ship was there. They were not happy American forces were stationed in that way. So as a consequence, McKinley decides he has to do something. It's February 15th. He doesn't go to war February 16th or 17th or 18th or 19th or 20th. Tries to find some way to, first of all, save face for himself. This is the problem, right? Once you send force in, you put your name on it, right? And second, he tries to find some way also to promise himself and others that he's going to bring more stability here. But he's not able to do that. The situation gets worse. He has very few tools in his toolkit. And he decides, and you have his explanation of how he decided this and other decisions in your reader. He decides that the United States should go to war. And so on the 29th of April, 1898, he goes to Congress and calls for a declaration of war. In fact, he goes a little earlier. I think there are days a number of days of debate. I don't remember offhand how many. And in a debate in Congress, Congress does decide to authorize the United States going to war. It's not unanimous. This is not something everyone agrees on. But he's able to convince the majority of the members of Congress that the United States has an interest in going to war to protect stability and prevent worse things from happening. Immediately as the United States goes to war, naval forces are sent to the island, and U.S. forces, U.S. Army forces in various kinds are sent on as well. Famously, Theodore Roosevelt raises a group of Rough Riders to go onto the island. And by January of 1899, so about 8 months later, the United States has seized control of this island. But of course, the question is what to do next. Yes? Right.
What's the American Navy in the Pacific doing when the Maine is blown up?
Okay, so the American Navy in the Pacific, Admiral Dewey, who I'll talk about in a second, he's near Hong Kong, basically. He's not involved in that. The American Navy has put more of a forward presence in the areas around Spanish-controlled Philippines, and that will become an issue. But initially, the movement is with the Maine. There's no direct threat to the Philippines until after the United States declares war. There's also the question then of what to do with Cuba once the United States is in control. And you have in your reader the Platt Amendment, right, which is very important. The Platt Amendment is an amendment designed by Senator Platt, written for the purposes of laying out what the United States should do and what the United States' role in Cuba should be. And the emphasis is on not establishing a formal colony, but establishing certain rules for appropriate Cuban independence. Rules about Cubans not making deals with other societies. Rules about sanitary conditions and about economic access. And the argument is that the United States will pull out, but the United States will have a permanent position of securing its interests in Cuba. Cuba will not just be a forward base, it will be a kind of protectorate in a sense, an independent protectorate. But there's a hope that in this context it will develop what Americans see as the appropriate forms of nation statehood. The Philippines becomes part of the story, not because Americans had any great interest in the Philippines. Most Americans at that time could not identify where the Philippines were. But the United States becomes part of this story, and the Philippines becomes part of the story because of, oh, and I should mention, I forgot to mention, one of the other parts of the Platt Amendment is the U.S. naval base, Guantanamo. I forgot to mention that, which becomes a permanent lease for the United States. Ironically, American government will put enemy combatants in Guantanamo after 9/11, 2001, because they are not on American territory, so they're not subjected to American law in this base that the United States holds in Cuba. It's a very ironic twist on what happens here. In the case of the Philippines, the United States becomes interested in the Philippines not because of any direct concern for the Philippines, but because of the Philippines' role in the Spanish Empire and a double concern. One, that the Spanish should not be allowed to move force from the Philippines into Cuba against the United States, and two, that the Philippines should be an area open as the Spanish Empire declines to American access and not closed off by other foreign powers. Both the British and the Germans had deep interests in taking control of that island archipelago, and you can see why. The Philippines is located very close to China. It's a perfect staging point by sea for getting access to China. The British already had Hong Kong, right, following the Opium Wars. And so the Philippines is an important staging point for trade in that area. The Germans and the British had interests in taking the Philippines from the Spanish. So the United States' dual concern is not allowing the Spanish to move force from the Philippines to Cuba, but also not letting other powers take control of the Philippines as the Spanish Empire enters this period of decline. So as a consequence, McKinley is convinced by Theodore Roosevelt and others, and as he explains in the interview you have in the Reader, also convinced, this comes back to Bill's question, by his sense of mission and duty in a time of war, that the United States now has to do more in the Philippines. So on May 1st of 1898, again, the war only started 29th of April, 1898 in Cuba. On May 1st, Admiral Dewey, the leader of the American fleet, commander of the American fleet around Hong Kong, moves into Manila and very quickly defeats the Spanish fleet in Manila, which was in very poor shape. This was not a great victory. I don't want to take anything away from Admiral Dewey, but the Spanish Navy was not, this was not the British Navy or the German Navy or the French Navy. The Spanish Navy around the Philippines was in very poor condition. And by the end of 1898, early 1899, the United States now finds itself in occupation of the Philippines. So by 1899, the United States is in control of both Cuba and the Philippines. Guam also becomes part of the United States' control during this period. Puerto Rico does as well. Hawaii does too, but Hawaii is a sort of separate story. There's an internal development in Hawaii related to American settlers, the end of the Queen's rule. But suffice it to say that by 1900 now, 1899, 1900, the United States has a lot of these possessions, a lot of these forward bases, a lot of these island areas. Notice none of them are large landed areas. All of them are islands. All of them are susceptible to naval power. All of them raise occupation issues. But none of them are about creating large landed areas of control, right? This is not British India we're talking about here in any way. In these areas, we have two sets of developments that I'll just talk about quickly related to where we started. In Cuba, the United States develops its first true counterinsurgency capability. And this counterinsurgency capability is designed for what is called at the time pacification. This should all sound familiar to you. American military forces that will work to stamp out those who are bringing violence to the area and empower local leaders who are seen as legitimate leaders. The United States' vision for Cuba is of an independent nation-state in Cuba run by a representative government, but a government that represents good business interests, good citizen interests, not revolutionaries. And a government that is willing to serve its people, but also work with the United States. Okay? It is to be a representative, American-style government, and the United States will find itself in the first half of the 20th century playing the role as police force for that government, in a sense, right, until the Cuban Revolution. I've forgotten your first name, I'm sorry. Russ.
This is often called the sort of the age of American imperialism, but given America's kinds of relationships America is trying to build with Cuba, the Philippines, and these other places, is it legitimate to call this? I mean, is it a misuse of the word imperialism?
It depends how you use the term.
I was going to ask.
Yeah.
That was my next question.
Yeah. It depends. So I would say you could argue there are imperial impulses here. but I would be careful not to call this, I mean, in my terms, and other historians disagree with me. We have arguments about this, so this is just my opinion. I don't want to call this imperialism or empire in the way that we talk about Europeans and others, because I think it's a different kind of thing. But I also don't want to say it's necessarily better. You know, I try to be careful about that. I think it's a vision, again, I think it's a vision of nation building. It's a vision of a world on a model of our own that is racially centered, ethnocentric, based upon our own perhaps provincial reading of history. But nonetheless, it's something different from the notion of keeping people in subordinate status forever, of maintaining large landed areas under control from far away. And it's inherently skeptical of basic army occupation of a society. Is someone at the door?
No, but it's time.
Is it? Oh, yeah. That's right. I'm going over already. Thank you, Angela. So we'll talk more about that. It's a great question. Let me just say a couple more words about the Philippines, then we'll break, and then what we'll do after break, we could take questions before I go into World War I, because hopefully we won't lose the screen for that lecture, so we won't lose as much time. This is terrible. Usually it's Wednesday I start going overtime. Monday I'm already going overtime. All right. So in the Philippines, we have a more complicated story, much of which I talk about in my book. But the biggest problem the United States faces in the Philippines is that once it takes Manila, there is a huge area to cover, and the United States is even less prepared for the Philippines than it is for Cuba. This is a long, drawn-out conflict in the Philippines. Americans seek, especially under William Howard Taft, who you've read a lot about in that chapter, to actually bring what they see as self-governance to the Philippines. But they are hamstrung in their own capabilities to do this, and they confront a popular, legitimate nationalist insurgency that does not want to build a nation-state in American style. The government Emilio Aguinaldo wants to build is a government that is not necessarily structured in American terms, that is not necessarily capitalist, that is not necessarily trading and giving access to the United States. He is not a communist or a socialist, but he is much more someone who wants to build a Philippines for Filipinos, not an open society in quite the same way. His vision is a legitimate one and a very different one from the United States. And one of the points about nation building is there can be competing nation building visions. So the United States spends an inordinate, in those terms, of time and money and bodies in this area. There are 41 months of warfare. 41 months of warfare. 126,000 Americans see service in the Philippines. 126,000 Americans saw service in the Philippines. Peak American strength in the Philippines is 70,000 soldiers. That's a lot for a society that doesn't have much of a standing army. 4,200 Americans are killed. The casualty rate is actually quite high. If you include kills and wounds, it's about 5.5%. About 5% of those 126,000 Americans who go over are injured in some way. Very high casualty rate. But that's only the beginnings of the story, right? About 20,000 Filipinos die. About 20,000 Filipinos. That's just an estimate. We don't really know. 200,000 more die from famine and other related disease. As you all know, war often kills more people than the diseases that are created and left in its wake. More Americans will die from influenza after World War I than from actual combat, right? That's part of the story here. This is a very, very bloody conflict. Two things have to be said about it, and then I will stop. On the one hand, it creates a long-term legacy of a bloody American relationship with people in Asia. This is only the beginning of a long history of the United States fighting land wars in Asia and different areas of Asia where there is a lot of blood, much more spilled by Asians than Americans, though a lot by Americans as well, with very controversial outcomes. That's one side that has to be confronted, that we have to talk about. The other side of it is that for all the bad things that happen, and they probably are more bad things than good things, the Philippines does actually move forward under American occupation as a united entity with a civilian government, with an educational system that moves the Philippines ahead most of its peers. And by the time the Japanese move in 1941-42, Filipinos will actually fight on the side of the Americans against the Japanese. The Japanese arrive and say, "We're here to liberate you." And the Filipinos say, well, no, we want to be liberated from the Americans, but we don't want to be liberated by you, and actually fight for the United States. And in fact, there is a very close American-Filipino relationship that lasts to this day. It's a dependent relationship. It's in many ways a dysfunctional relationship. It's a relationship filled with racism, filled with inequality. But it's also a lot better than most of the other examples. In Austria. Okay, so that's one element of it, right? There's the military power we take for granted today, and cultural influence, right? Is there anyone in the world who doesn't know who Michael Jordan is, or Kobe Bryant, or LeBron James, right? Is there anyone in the world, in any major urban area, who has not heard a few words of English? Run it the other way. Are there any Americans who have heard any words of Swahili? How many are they? How often do Americans hear non-English languages spoken? How often do non-Americans hear American English spoken? They might not be able to speak English. There are more Spanish and Chinese speakers in the world than there are English speakers, but there are more people who can identify English than any other language in the world. That's part of American cultural influence. That world of an American military presence in 140 countries and that world of American cultural presence begins in the late 19th century. Before the late 19th century, it would have been a joke to tell Europeans or Asians that the United States would be a major cultural influence. We were a backwater, and it would have been a joke to tell them we would have been a major military presence, right? It is in the late 19th century that that story begins. Again, that is not the end of isolation. That is a redefinition of American power, the redefinition of American power that we'll talk about today. So this image that we have up here is, I don't know, can everyone see? Is just an image of Americans actually in Cuba. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is why, in 1898, do American forces end up in occupation, temporarily, of Cuba, but creating a long-term American protectorate, in a sense, over Cuba, and of course a long-term occupation of the Philippines? Why do we get involved in nation building in these places in 1898? And that's related, of course, to these three themes. That's where we'll end today in explaining those events. You cannot understand those wars, you cannot understand those occupations if you don't understand the broader transformations that are going on during this period. So I'll begin with just a list of topics. I'll try to do this with every lecture just so we sort of know where we're going and you can hold me accountable. What will often happen, hopefully not today, is by the time we get to point 3, I'll be rushing really fast. And Wendy will start laughing at me in the back. I want to talk about this third theme I already brought up, power and vulnerabilities. How does the United States become more powerful? What does that mean when we say that? But how does power bring more vulnerability with it, right? This is the Shakespearean side of American history, right? And Shakespeare did understand it all, right? That the more powerful one becomes, the more vulnerable and weak. Every Shakespearean hero, right, is also a victim. Every Shakespearean hero is a victim, right? Not because of moral clairvoyance, but because of the nature of the way in which the system works. The more powerful you are, the more vulnerable you are, the more places you have. In the words of one great British historian, the larger you become, the more toes and fingers you have spread, and therefore the more vulnerable you are to some weaker person chopping off one of your toes. And let me start us out with a couple of big themes that are going to be themes for our discussions all week. And there are 3 of them in particular that we'll come back to time and again. And I hope these are themes that are helpful for your teaching, themes that are crucial for understanding the development of American society, for understanding the development of foreign policy, and most importantly, for understanding the development of the international system as we know it, which is the relationship between societies and cultures and states that we think of when we talk about foreign policy, when we talk about something like the war on terror or the Cold War. It's the system of different societies interacting with one another. The first big theme is a theme I want to try to capture at the start of our discussions, which is the nature of how American society's relationship to this broader world changed in the late 19th century. There is a big myth about American history, the myth we might call of isolation. How many people have used the term isolationism in their teaching, right? There's nothing wrong with using that term. There were people who were identified, usually by their opponents, sometimes by themselves, as being isolationists. And they were generally figures who believed that the United States should have a minimal role in entangling itself, in the words of Washington's farewell address, entangling itself in these 1796 words, in the alliances and operations of other societies, that we should stay apart, that we should be a city upon a hill, and be separate from the corruptions of other societies. That was the general argument that people identified as isolationists made, and it's okay to call them isolationists. But I think the first big theme, and it'll run through our entire week, is that it is absolutely crucial that we understand the United States was never actually isolated from the world. There was never a moment when Americans were separated from global developments. What happened in the late 19th century, what we'll talk about today, is the way in which America's long-standing interaction with other societies became broader, deeper, and more direct than it had ever been before, and in particular, more directly militarized than it had ever been before. But this is not new in the sense that Americans had been interacting with broad contours, broad activities, broad societies outside their borders for a long time. We know that from the story of our own revolution. We know that from the story of the War of 1812. We know that fundamentally because Americans have been traders from the very beginning. And who have they traded with? They have traded with non-Americans, be they Indians on our own territory, members of the Spanish Empire south, Europeans to the west, and Asians, Europeans to the east, Asians to the west. I had my geography right here. So this notion of American isolation is actually a myth in that sense. And one of the big themes that we'll be discussing will be the ways in which Americans have been long connected to broader developments, but the ways those connections changed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that's one big theme. A second theme, a theme that will run through any discussion that we will have about American foreign relations, is the way in which the external interactions affect the internal organization of American politics, and vice versa. There is an interpenetration between the foreign policy and domestic policy making. That's our second big theme, right? That foreign policy and domestic policy are deeply intertwined. And particularly from the late 19th century on, this intertwining, this interdependence grows tighter and tighter. It's impossible to think about a figure like Theodore Roosevelt without connecting his foreign policy and domestic policy. It's impossible to think about a figure like Woodrow Wilson without connecting foreign policy and domestic policy. We tend to separate these things in the ways we organize our newspapers, and sometimes even in the ways we teach, right? But one of the things I think we need to figure out are new ways to connect those things, and that resonates with people today. They see that. Where did Mitt Romney go this last week? He went overseas to politic at home, right? These are deeply interrelated phenomena. Okay, the third big theme, we have the theme of American interaction and non-isolation. We have the connection between foreign and domestic politics. The third big theme will be power itself. How does American power change? And that's really where and why we start when we're talking about modern American foreign policy, why we start with the late 19th century, because modern American power on the international stage as we know it really begins then. And you will hear in today's lecture a lot of resonances with our own world, not simply because the past resonates with the present, but because there's a particular connection between the late 19th century and today. It is in the late 19th century when American power becomes more connected to military and cultural influence beyond traditional economic influences. If traditionally American interactions with the wider world stemmed around issues of trade and commerce, going back to the 18th century, and some interchange of ideas, the ways in which the Founding Fathers and others interchanged ideas with other societies, now in the late 19th century, the growth of the American economy becomes connected to the growth of American cultural influence and the growth of American military capability. And it is the cultural influence beyond American borders, and it is the military capabilities that are unprecedented. So generally when people say Americans come out of isolation in the late 19th century, what they really are saying is not that Americans were isolated before, but that American power had been less military and less cultural before, had been more economic. Okay? But now the United States becomes a military and cultural player in the way we think of today. If you go almost anywhere in the world today, there are two things you will find, right? Two things you will find almost anywhere in the world. Americans in uniform. We have soldiers on, I think it's 140 bases around the world, right? Well, bases in 140 countries. Most are non-official, not sort of major military bases, but there's an American military presence everywhere. I was just in Germany and Austria the last 2 months. You can't go very far without seeing American servicemen in Germany's or fingers, right? The more dependent you become on the world. That's part of the story of the late 19th century. I want to then talk about this phrase that's used by a very famous military historian, Russell Weigley, called the American way of war. And I want us to look at how Americans develop in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans, foreign policy people, ordinary citizens, a way of thinking about their place in the world that's different, a way in which they think about war and diplomacy and politics in a new way. That doesn't mean they all agree. They don't. But I do believe that people come to think about how things connect in new ways when there is this kind of phase shift in power. What are the new assumptions? What are the unstated ways in which Americans grapple with these new issues? How do Americans think about themselves differently? Or to put it in other terms, what is it that makes someone who talks about foreign policy in 1898 so different from someone who would be talking about it in 1868? Right? You can draw a line from Lincoln to Theodore Roosevelt, but in fact, they're still talking in different languages about power, thinking about American power in different ways. Why is that? And what is this new way of war? And how does it resonate forward to us? And then I want to take us in that context, as we do as historians. Once we've set the context, once we've understood these changes, then I want to walk us through the actual events of the Spanish-American War, of the American occupation of Cuba and the American occupation of the Philippines, and understand how that draws upon these shifts, but also influences these shifts. What I'm doing here is, at least the way I like to think about history, is that you have two things going on at the same time. You have broader shifts that no one person or group of people control. They are broader shifts related to the landscape, related to the economics, related to technology, related to broader phenomenon that no one controls. But those broader shifts do not create inevitable outcomes. Individuals then make decisions about how to inflect those shifts. So to put it in an analogy of our world today, you have a global debt crisis that no one controls, but yet there are big choices people make about what to do in a global debt crisis, what to cut and what not to cut. You had broader shifts in American power and the relationship of American power to that of other societies due to economic change, due to the railroad, which I'll talk about, due to the nature of American society after the Civil War. No one controlled that. But people like William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt and others made choices about how to inflect those shifts. Human beings don't make history as they like, but they do make history nonetheless. That's my derivation on Marx, right? Marx said it a slightly different way, but that's my derivation on Marx for us. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the changes in American power and vulnerabilities. And a place where historians often start, I'm sure some of you have used this already, is with the World's Fairs of the late 19th century, in particular the Columbian Exposition. I always have trouble with that word, the Columbian Exposition of 1893, which was designed in Chicago to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus's sailing to North America. Now, I always ask smart students, why was it in 1893 if he sailed in 1492? Any thoughts on that? Well, he did arrive in 1492. Huh? Okay, he didn't return to Spain until 1890. That is an argument some made at the time, yes?
It takes a long time to build the World's Fair.
Yes, yes. Actually, the real answer is it was intended to be in 1892, and they didn't get their act together. So they were a year behind. Right, it's important to know that that doesn't only happen in our world. The 1893 Columbian Exposition was designed to showcase a number of things. First of all, it was showcasing Chicago. Chicago was a backwater city until really the 1860s and 1870s. It comes of age with the marrying of new forms of power that are quintessentially American. In the words of Bill Cronin, a very wonderful historian of Chicago, it is the mix of pigs and railroads that makes Chicago. By the late 19th century, more hogs are being slaughtered in Chicago than any other city. And one thing we have to remember is what a city like Chicago would have smelled like at the time. Our cities are now sanitized, right? Or if they smell of, well, things that people are smoking for various reasons. They don't actually smell of the food that people are making in the same way. The city actually was a place that, with railroad technology and the creation of a modern integrated economy on a size that no other society had at that time, Americans were able to move more agricultural product from west to Chicago, and in Chicago prepare it for manufacture and export elsewhere. Why Chicago? Because of Chicago's position on Lake Michigan and because of its role as a hub for all the Western Branch Railway lines. Okay? No other society, it sounds so strange now to say, no other society in the late 19th century had more railroad stock than the United States. No society was building it faster, no society had more of it. That seems so strange a century later when we have no railroads, right, of any real kind to speak of for at least non-commercial heavy travel. And no other society had as much land that was in agricultural use, producing as much that could be manufactured as quickly and efficiently as the United States. What the Civil War did, and Reconstruction after the Civil War, was create an integrated, single continental economy. The railroad provided the sinew, provided the transportation. Chicago and other hubs, what Bill Cronin calls nature's metropolis, right? These cities became places, right, where the agricultural product was brought in, capital value was added to it, and it was sent out. That is not how traditional European cities